The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Captain Sarah Williams pushed through the glass doors of Miller's grocery store. Her shoulders ached from a 14-hour shift that had included 2 domestic violence calls, a robbery investigation, and endless paperwork that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. Exhaustion weighed heavy in her bones, settling deep into muscles that had carried the burden of leadership for more years than she cared to count. She wore a simple gray sweatshirt and faded jeans, her badge and uniform safely locked away in her patrol car outside, the metal shield that usually commanded respect now hidden from view. All she wanted was to grab milk, bread, and something quick for dinner before heading home to her empty apartment, where silence awaited her like an old friend. Sarah had earned her captain's stripes through 23 years of dedicated service, climbing ranks in a profession that rarely welcomed women like her. She had weathered countless storms of prejudice, proving herself worthy of respect through sheer determination and unwavering integrity. Each promotion had been hard-fought, each commendation earned through sacrifice and perseverance that her male colleagues could never fully understand. She had broken barriers, mentored younger officers, and built bridges between the department and communities that had long viewed law enforcement with suspicion and fear. Tonight, however, she was just another tired woman trying to complete mundane errands after a long day, seeking nothing more than the simple pleasure of choosing her own groceries without interference or judgment. The store bustled with evening shoppers, each person absorbed in their own world of mundane decisions and everyday concerns. Families rushed through aisles with crying children and overflowing carts, their conversations mixing with the constant hum of refrigeration units and the rhythmic beeping of checkout scanners. Teenagers clustered near the candy section, their laughter cutting through the ambient noise while they debated the merits of various snacks with the seriousness that only adolescence could bring to such matters. Elderly couples moved slowly with their carts, pausing to compare prices and read ingredients with the careful attention of people for whom every dollar mattered and every dietary choice carried weight. Sarah grabbed a red plastic basket from the stack near the entrance, its handle worn smooth by countless hands, and headed toward the dairy section with the efficient movements of someone who knew exactly what she needed. Her mind was already planning tomorrow's crime briefing, reviewing case files and considering staffing assignments while her body moved through the familiar routine of grocery shopping. She had no idea that her simple shopping trip, this most ordinary of human activities, would soon become the most humiliating and transformative experience of her career. A moment that would strip away her professional identity and force her to confront the harsh realities that so many citizens faced when encountering law enforcement without the protection of a badge. As Sarah reached for a gallon of milk, she noticed eyes following her movements with uncomfortable intensity. The store's security guard, a heavy-set man in his 50s named Chuck Brennan, leaned against a display case, watching her with suspicious interest that bordered on obsession. His gaze lingered too long, studying her every gesture as if cataloging evidence for some invisible crime. Chuck had worked security for 12 years, and he prided himself on spotting troublemakers before they could act. He had attended countless seminars on retail theft prevention, memorizing behavioral patterns and warning signs that supposedly identified potential shoplifters. To him, Sarah's tired demeanor and casual clothing fit a profile he had memorized from countless training videos, a profile that unconsciously associated certain demographics with criminal behavior. Her simple act of shopping had triggered alarms in his mind that had nothing to do with her actual actions, and everything to do with his preconceived notions about who belonged in his store and who represented a threat. Several shoppers also began to notice the woman moving through their aisles, their attention drawn by some invisible signal that marked her as different, as dangerous, as unworthy of the same courtesy they extended to others. Margaret Henderson, a school board member with perfectly styled silver hair and a wardrobe that spoke of comfortable privilege, nudged her husband when she spotted Sarah examining cereal boxes with the careful attention of someone trying to stretch a budget. "Look at that one," she whispered, her voice carrying just loud enough for nearby customers to hear, each word dripping with assumptions that had been years in the making. "Something's not right about the way she's acting. Mark my words, she's up to no good." Her husband, Robert, nodded knowingly, his face settling into the expression of a man who had found validation for beliefs he had never questioned. They had seen plenty of news stories about retail theft, and their assumptions about who committed such crimes were deeply ingrained, fed by media narratives and social conversations that painted complex issues in simple, biased terms. The idea that they might be witnessing nothing more than a tired woman shopping for groceries never crossed their minds. So certain were they in their prejudices. Sarah remained oblivious to the growing attention, her mind occupied with the mental checklist that had become second nature after years of managing both a household and a demanding career. She added bread to her basket, selected a frozen dinner that promised to be both nutritious and quick to prepare, and picked up a small bunch of bananas that would serve as breakfast for the next several days. Every movement was ordinary, purposeful, and entirely legal, the actions of a responsible adult managing the basic necessities of life. Yet, in the minds of those watching, her simple behaviors took on sinister meaning, transformed by the lens of prejudice and assumption into evidence of criminal intent. The way she paused to check prices became suspicious hesitation, as if she were calculating the value of potential stolen goods. Her tired movements, the natural result of a demanding day spent serving her community, were interpreted as nervous behavior indicative of guilt. The very act of shopping while black, of existing in a public space with the same rights and expectations as any other customer, had somehow transformed her into a criminal in their eyes. Chuck Brennan adjusted his position to maintain visual contact, his radio close at hand as he prepared to alert authorities about what he was certain was an imminent crime. Other shoppers began to whisper among themselves, their voices carrying speculation and judgment that spread through the store like a virus, infecting every interaction with suspicion and malice. Chuck Brennan reached for his radio. He had seen enough. This woman was clearly casing the store, probably waiting for the right moment to stuff merchandise into that oversized sweatshirt. He pressed the call button and spoke quietly into the device. "Control, this is Miller's Grocery. I've got a suspicious individual here. Probable shoplifter. Can you send a unit for backup?" The dispatcher's voice crackled back, confirming that officers would respond immediately. Within minutes, 2 patrol cars pulled into the parking lot, their occupants eager to respond to what dispatch had classified as a potential theft in progress. Officers Jake Morrison and Tony Castellano stepped out, adjusting their duty belts with the practiced movements of men who had performed this ritual countless times before. Morrison, a 5-year veteran with a reputation for aggressive enforcement and little patience for what he considered criminal excuses, looked forward to easy arrests that boosted his monthly statistics and reinforced his belief that swift action prevented larger problems. His approach to policing was shaped by military service, that had taught him to view encounters in terms of dominance and submission, us versus them dynamics that left little room for nuance or empathy. Castellano, newer to the force with only 18 months of experience, typically followed his partner's lead without question, his natural instincts for caution overwhelmed by Morrison's confidence and the department culture that rewarded aggressive enforcement over thoughtful investigation. Neither officer bothered to ask for details about the alleged crime, accepting Chuck Brennan's assessment as fact rather than opinion, their minds already made up about what they would find and how they would handle it. They entered the store with purpose, scanning the aisles until Chuck pointed in Sarah's direction. She stood near the checkout lines, counting money in her wallet and preparing to pay for her groceries. The officers approached from behind, their hands resting on their service weapons. "Ma'am," Morrison called out sharply. "We need to talk to you." Sarah turned around, confusion evident on her face. She had done nothing wrong, purchased nothing yet, and had no idea why 2 officers were addressing her with such hostile tones. "Is there a problem, officers?" she asked calmly, her professional training automatically engaging despite her civilian status. "We have reports that you've been shoplifting," Morrison declared loudly, his voice carrying across the store. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. Shopping carts came to a standstill as customers craned their necks to witness the unfolding drama. "We're going to need you to put that basket down and step away from the register." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Shoplifting. The accusation hung in the air, transforming her from customer to criminal in the eyes of everyone present. She looked down at her basket, containing items she had every intention of purchasing, and felt a familiar rage building in her chest. This was not her first encounter with baseless suspicion, but never before had she been publicly accused of theft while simply shopping. "There must be some mistake," Sarah said evenly, though her heart pounded against her ribs. "I haven't stolen anything. I was just about to pay for these items." She gestured toward her basket, but Morrison stepped closer, his face set in a mask of authority and suspicion. "That's what they all say," Castellano chimed in, emboldened by his partner's aggressive stance. "Why don't you just make this easy on everyone and cooperate?" The humiliation began in earnest as Morrison grabbed Sarah's basket and dumped its contents onto the floor with unnecessary force. The sound of impact echoing through the suddenly quiet store like thunder announcing an approaching storm. Milk splashed across the polished tiles, creating white rivers that flowed between the scattered items of her intended purchase. Bread tumbled from its package, slices separating and falling like defeated soldiers on a battlefield of false accusations. The frozen dinner slid under a nearby cart while bananas rolled in different directions, their yellow brightness a stark contrast to the gray despair that was settling over Sarah's shoulders. Shoppers gasped and pointed with the excitement of spectators at a gladiatorial contest, their phones appearing as if summoned by some invisible signal, eager to capture and share this moment of another person's degradation. Sarah watched her simple groceries become evidence in a crime she had never committed. Each item transformed from necessity into accusation by the perverted logic of presumption and prejudice. The receipt in her wallet, proof of her intention to pay, remained unexamined as Morrison assumed her guilt based on nothing more than Chuck Brennan's suspicions and his own biased expectations about who belonged in his definition of criminal behavior. "Check her pockets," Morrison commanded, though he had no probable cause for such a search. Sarah stood frozen, knowing that any resistance would only escalate the situation. She thought of her badge, locked safely in her patrol car, and wondered if she should identify herself. But pride and principle held her back. Why should she have to prove her worthiness to be treated with basic human dignity? Chuck Brennan appeared beside the officers, eager to share his observations. "I've been watching her for 20 minutes, he announced to anyone within earshot. Classic shoplifter behavior. The way she was moving around, checking over her shoulder, acting all nervous." His description bore no resemblance to Sarah's actual behavior, but the gathered crowd accepted his words as truth. Margaret Henderson moved closer, her face twisted with righteous indignation. "I saw it too," she declared, though she had witnessed nothing more than a woman shopping for groceries. "These people think they can just take whatever they want. It's disgraceful." Her husband nodded vigorously, and murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Sarah felt the walls closing in as more voices joined the chorus of condemnation. Strangers who had never seen her before tonight spoke about her as if they knew her character, her history, her very soul. They saw only her skin color and made assumptions that painted her as guilty before any evidence existed. The injustice was suffocating, but she remained silent, knowing that any words she spoke would likely be twisted against her. Morrison grabbed Sarah's arm roughly, his grip leaving marks that would fade long before the emotional scars healed. "We're taking you in for questioning," he announced with the satisfaction of a man who believed he was serving justice, producing handcuffs from his belt with practiced efficiency. The metal was cold against her wrists, as he secured them behind her back, each click echoing through the store like a gunshot that announced her guilt to everyone present. Sarah kept her head high, drawing on reserves of dignity that had been built through years of professional service and personal struggle, refusing to give the crowd the satisfaction of seeing her break beneath the weight of their collective condemnation. But inside, something fundamental was cracking. A faith in fairness and justice that had sustained her through decades of service was being systematically destroyed by the very people she had sworn to protect and serve alongside. The handcuffs were not just restraining her body, they were shackling her spirit, binding her to a moment that would forever change how she viewed the world and her place within it. As they marched her toward the exit, shoppers pressed closer, eager to witness the conclusion of the evening's entertainment. Someone called out, "About time someone did something about all this stealing." Another voice added, "They should search all of them when they come in here." The ugly truth of their prejudices spilled out freely, emboldened by the apparent validation of their suspicions. Sarah was pushed through the same doors she had entered less than an hour earlier, but everything had changed. Then she had been a customer, a contributing member of society, a woman with dignity and purpose. Now she was a suspect, a criminal, a cautionary tale whispered about in checkout lines and coffee shops across town. The patrol car's backseat was cramped and uncomfortable, the mesh partition a barrier between her and the officers who had destroyed her evening. Morrison drove, while Castellano twisted in his seat to stare at their prisoner. "You picked the wrong store on the wrong night," he said with satisfaction. "We don't tolerate thieves around here." Sarah closed her eyes and tried to center herself, drawing on decades of training and experience. She had seen innocent people arrested before, had witnessed the system's failures firsthand. But experiencing it from this side of the handcuffs was a revelation that shook her to her core. Every traffic light they passed felt like a countdown to professional ruin. Every turn brought them closer to a booking process that would forever mark her as a suspect in official records. The police station appeared ahead, its brick facade and barred windows as familiar to Sarah as her own home. She had walked through those doors thousands of times, commanding respect and wielding authority. Tonight, she would enter as the accused, stripped of dignity and presumed guilty by those she had once called colleagues. News traveled fast in their small town, spreading through networks of gossip and assumption with the speed of wildfire in dry brush. Even before Sarah's patrol car arrived at the station, word of her arrest had begun spreading through phone calls and text messages, each retelling adding new layers of fiction to an already distorted narrative. The story grew more dramatic with each transmission, transformed by the collective imagination of a community eager for entertainment and validation of their worst assumptions. A dangerous shoplifter became an armed robber. A peaceful arrest became a violent confrontation. A criminal caught red-handed became a repeat offender with a long history of theft. None of these versions bore any resemblance to the truth, but truth had become irrelevant in the face of collective assumptions and prejudice that found vindication in Sarah's arrest. Social media platforms buzzed with commentary, speculation, and condemnation from people who had never witnessed the incident but felt qualified to judge both Sarah's character and the officer's response. The story took on a life of its own, feeding on bias and ignorance, while growing stronger with each share, each comment, each assumption masquerading as fact. Sarah's sister, Monica, was washing dishes in her modest kitchen when her neighbor called with the shocking news, the phone ringing with the insistence of an emergency that demanded immediate attention. "They arrested someone at Miller's tonight," the neighbor said breathlessly, her voice filled with the excitement that comes from being the first to share dramatic news. "Some woman who was stealing, making a real scene from what I heard. Security had to call the police and everything. I thought you should know because she kind of looked like your sister, though I'm sure it wasn't her." Monica dropped the phone, her hands shaking as she tried to process the impossible information while soap suds dripped from her fingers onto the linoleum floor. Her sister was a police captain, not a criminal, a woman who had dedicated her life to upholding the law and protecting others. There had to be some mistake, some terrible confusion that would be cleared up as soon as someone with authority took a closer look at what had really happened. But as she reached for her car keys with trembling hands, Monica felt a cold dread settling in her stomach, the recognition that in a world where assumptions mattered more than facts, even her accomplished sister was not safe from the poison of prejudice that infected every level of society. The drive to the police station felt endless, each traffic light a barrier between her and the truth she desperately needed to hear, each mile marked by prayers that her worst fears would prove unfounded. At the station, Sarah was processed like any other suspect, subjected to the systematic machinery of criminal justice that she had helped operate for more than 2 decades but had never experienced from this perspective. Fingerprints were taken with methodical precision, her hands pressed against the digital scanner while instructions were barked at her in tones that brooked no argument or explanation. Photographs followed, the harsh flash capturing her face from multiple angles while she stood against a height chart that reduced her from a human being to a set of measurements and identifying characteristics. Personal property inventory came next, each item from her wallet, pockets, and purse catalogued and stored away as if her possessions were evidence of wrongdoing rather than the ordinary accumulation of a normal life. Each step was a systematic destruction of her identity as Captain Sarah Williams, reducing her from a respected law enforcement officer to case number 24,897, a statistical entry in the endless stream of arrests that flowed through the system without regard for individual circumstances or the possibility of mistake. The booking officer, Detective Lisa Rodriguez, worked efficiently, unaware that she was processing one of the department's highest-ranking officers, treating Sarah with the same detached professionalism that she applied to every suspect who passed through her domain. Sarah watched the familiar routine from an entirely new perspective, understanding for the first time how dehumanizing the experience truly was, how the process itself transformed people from complex individuals with histories and relationships into nothing more than potential criminals defined by their alleged offenses. "Phone call," Rodriguez announced, sliding a telephone across the metal table. Sarah stared at the device for a long moment, considering her options. She could call her sister, her lawyer, even the chief of police. But first, she needed to try a different approach. "I need to speak with the watch commander," Sarah said quietly. Rodriguez looked up from her paperwork, surprised by the request. Most suspects wanted to call family or attorneys, not ranking officers. "The watch commander is busy processing arrests," Rodriguez replied dismissively. "You can speak with him during your interview tomorrow. Tell him Captain Sarah Williams needs to see him immediately," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority she had spent decades cultivating. Rodriguez paused, studying the woman across the table with new interest. Something in Sarah's tone suggested this was not a typical arrest. Rodriguez made the call, and within minutes, Lieutenant David Chen appeared in the booking room. He was young for his rank, having risen quickly through merit and dedication. He had heard Sarah's name mentioned with respect throughout the department but had never met her personally. When he saw her sitting in handcuffs, his confusion was evident. "You requested to see me?" Chen asked uncertainly. Sarah looked directly into his eyes, her professional demeanor intact despite her circumstances. "I'm Captain Sarah Williams, 3rd District," she said simply. "Check my identification. It's in my wallet, which your officers confiscated during my unlawful arrest." Chen's face went pale as the implications hit him. He rushed to retrieve Sarah's personal effects, his hands trembling as he opened her wallet. The police identification card stared back at him, complete with photo, badge number, and rank insignia. Captain Sarah Williams. 23 years of service. recipient of multiple commendations for bravery and leadership. The room fell silent as Chen processed the gravity of the situation, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, horror, and dawning comprehension of the catastrophe that had just unfolded under his watch. He had just witnessed the arrest and booking of one of his superior officers, a woman whose reputation within the department was not just impeccable, but legendary among those who understood the challenges of rising through the ranks, while facing the double burden of racial and gender discrimination. Captain Sarah Williams was known throughout law enforcement circles as a leader who had earned respect through competence, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to justice that had made her a role model for younger officers and a trusted colleague among her peers. The officers who had arrested her, the security guard who had reported her, the shoppers who had condemned her, none of them had bothered to look beyond their assumptions, to consider that their preconceptions might be wrong, to entertain the possibility that they were witnessing not a crime but the exercise of a fundamental right to exist in public spaces without suspicion or harassment. The weight of institutional embarrassment pressed down on Chen's shoulders as he realized that this incident would not remain confined to their small department but would inevitably attract attention from media outlets, civil rights organizations, and oversight bodies that had been waiting for exactly this kind of proof that systemic bias was not just a theoretical problem, but a daily reality for citizens who happened to be black. "Remove those handcuffs immediately," Chen ordered Rodriguez, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. As the metal restraints fell away, Sarah rubbed her wrists and stood slowly. She was no longer a suspect but a ranking officer who had been grievously wronged by her own department. "I want the arrest report, the incident narrative, and the names of every officer involved," Sarah said calmly. "I also want the security footage from Miller's grocery store, and a complete list of witnesses who made statements against me." Chen nodded quickly, already mentally preparing the damage control that would be necessary. This was not just a wrongful arrest, but a public relations disaster waiting to explode. A respected police captain, arrested for shoplifting while purchasing groceries. The story would write itself, and the headlines would be devastating. As word of Sarah's true identity spread through the station, a parade of embarrassed officers appeared to offer apologies and explanations. Morrison and Castellano were summoned immediately, their faces ashen as they realized the magnitude of their mistake. They had arrested their own superior officer based on nothing more than racial profiling and unfounded suspicions. "Captain Williams," Morrison stammered, "if we had known who you were." His words trailed off as he realized how they sounded. Sarah's identity should not have mattered. Every citizen deserved to shop without being suspected of crimes they had not committed. "If you had known who I was, what?" Sarah asked pointedly. "You would have treated me with dignity. You would have investigated before making assumptions? Or would you have simply chosen a different target for your prejudice?" The questions hung in the air, unanswerable because the truth was too uncomfortable to acknowledge. Morrison and Castellano had seen a black woman shopping and immediately assumed criminality. Her rank, her service record, her character, none of these things had been visible to them through the lens of their bias. Chief Patricia Sullivan arrived at the station within an hour of Sarah's revelation. She was a veteran administrator who had navigated countless departmental crises, but this situation was unprecedented. One of her most respected captains had been arrested, humiliated, and processed like a common criminal by members of her own force. "Sarah," Chief Sullivan said quietly, "I don't have adequate words for what happened tonight. This is not who we are as a department, and it's not what we stand for as professionals." Sarah listened without expression, her mind already moving beyond apologies toward consequences and accountability. The damage had been done, not just to her personally but to every citizen who might find themselves in similar circumstances without the protection of a badge and rank. "The officers will face disciplinary action," Sullivan continued. "We'll review our training protocols, examine our response procedures, and ensure that nothing like this ever happens again." "With respect, Chief," Sarah replied, "this isn't about training protocols. This is about fundamental biases that exist within our ranks and throughout our community. Tonight I experienced what countless other citizens have endured without recourse or vindication." The conversation continued for another hour, but Sarah knew that words alone would not remedy the situation. Real change would require sustained effort, uncomfortable conversations, and a willingness to confront systemic problems that many preferred to ignore. As dawn approached, Sarah finally left the station where she had spent the night as a prisoner rather than a colleague. The morning shift was arriving, and she could see questions in their eyes as they recognized her. The story would spread quickly through the department, then beyond into the community at large. By afternoon, local news outlets had picked up the story with the enthusiasm of journalists who recognized a narrative that would capture public attention and generate the engagement that drove modern media economics. Police captain arrested. While shopping became the headline that dominated television broadcasts and newspaper websites, accompanied by still images from security footage that showed clearly the injustice of what had transpired. The video evidence was damning in its simplicity, showing Sarah moving through the store with the ordinary purpose of any customer, her hands visible at all times, her actions transparent and innocent to anyone watching without the filter of prejudice that had distorted the perceptions of those present that night. News anchors struggled to find ways to present the story that would not completely indict the officers involved, balancing their relationships with law enforcement against the obvious reality that a grave injustice had occurred in full view of security cameras that captured every moment of Sarah's humiliation. Editorial boards convened emergency meetings to decide how to frame their coverage, weighing the need for accountability against concerns about undermining police authority in a community that prided itself on law and order values that had apparently failed spectacularly when applied to one of their own officers. Public reaction was swift and divided. Many citizens expressed outrage at the obvious injustice and racial profiling that had occurred. Others defended the officers' actions, claiming they had followed proper procedures based on the information available. The divide revealed deeper truths about the community's attitudes toward race, justice, and law enforcement. Morrison and Castellano were suspended pending a full investigation. Chuck Brennan was terminated from his security position at Miller's grocery store. Margaret Henderson and the other customers who had condemned Sarah faced no official consequences, but their words captured on security footage became a source of community shame and reflection. Sarah returned to duty a week later, walking through the station doors, with the same confidence she had always displayed. Her colleagues watched nervously, unsure how to interact with someone who had experienced such a profound breach of trust from their own ranks. Some offered support and solidarity. Others maintained an uncomfortable distance, as if her experience might somehow be contagious. The incident sparked broader conversations about bias training, community relations, and the experiences of minority officers within law enforcement. Sarah found herself thrust into a spotlight she had never sought, becoming a reluctant spokesperson for issues she had quietly navigated throughout her career. During a departmental meeting, she addressed her fellow officers directly. "What happened to me could happen to any citizen we serve," she said. "If we cannot see past our assumptions long enough to treat people with basic dignity, then we have failed in our most fundamental duty." The room was quiet as officers absorbed her words. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing themselves in her critique. Others nodded with understanding, having witnessed similar injustices throughout their careers, but lacked the courage or platform to address them. Sarah's experience became a catalyst for policy changes within the department, sparking reforms that had been needed for years but had lacked the dramatic impetus necessary to overcome institutional resistance. New protocols were established for investigating reported crimes, requiring officers to gather substantial evidence before making arrests based on suspicion alone, a change that challenged long-standing practices rooted in assumption rather than investigation. Cultural sensitivity training was expanded and made mandatory for all personnel. From rookie officers to seasoned veterans, who resented being told that their methods might be flawed. Community outreach programs were enhanced to build trust between law enforcement and the diverse populations they served, recognizing that effective policing required cooperation and respect rather than fear and intimidation. Review boards were established to examine complaints of bias, creating accountability mechanisms that had previously been absent from departmental operations. These changes were not implemented without resistance from officers who viewed them as politically motivated interference with traditional policing methods, but Sarah's experience had created an undeniable case for reform that could not be ignored or dismissed. But Sarah knew that policy changes alone would not eliminate the biases that had led to her arrest, would not reach into the hearts and minds of individuals who carried prejudices so deeply ingrained that they operated below the level of conscious awareness. Real transformation required something far more challenging than procedural modifications or mandatory training sessions that officers attended with reluctant compliance and minimal engagement. It demanded that individuals examine their own assumptions with the kind of brutal honesty that most people found uncomfortable, challenge their preconceptions about race, class, and criminality with the courage that came from acknowledging personal fallibility, and commit to treating every person they encountered with respect and dignity regardless of race, appearance, or social status. The work was personal as well as professional, requiring each officer to confront not just departmental policies but their own upbringing, their own experiences, their own fears and assumptions about who deserved suspicion and who deserved the benefit of the doubt. Sarah had become living proof that even those who wore the badge were not immune to the prejudices that infected society at large, that authority and respectability offered no protection against the poison of assumption and stereotype, that could transform any black person into a suspect, regardless of their actual behavior or intentions. Months later, Sarah received a letter from a young black woman who had seen news coverage of the incident, a piece of correspondence that would become one of her most treasured possessions. "Thank you for standing strong," the woman wrote in handwriting that spoke of careful education and thoughtful consideration. "Knowing that someone like you refused to be broken by injustice gives me hope that things can change. I'm starting college next year to study criminal justice because of your example, because you showed me that it's possible to fight for what's right even when the system fails you. You turned your pain into purpose, and that inspires me to believe that I can do the same." Sarah kept the letter in her desk drawer, reading it whenever the weight of her experience threatened to overwhelm her sense of purpose, whenever the cynicism that came from seeing the worst of human nature began to erode her faith in the possibility of positive change. The letter reminded her that her suffering had not been in vain, that her willingness to speak truth about injustice had created ripples that extended far beyond her own experience, inspiring others to pursue careers in law enforcement, with the goal of reforming it from within. She had become, without choosing it, a symbol of resilience and hope for people who had long felt excluded from the promise of equal justice under law. The case never went to trial because there had never been any evidence of wrongdoing. The charges were dismissed immediately upon revelation of Sarah's identity, but the dismissal felt hollow without acknowledgement of the broader injustice that had occurred. Sarah had not been vindicated because she was a police captain. She had been vindicated because she was innocent, just as she had been innocent from the moment she walked into Miller's grocery store. On quiet evenings, Sarah sometimes returned to that same store to shop for groceries. The experience was different now. Employees recognized her, customers whispered as she passed, and security cameras tracked her movements with uncomfortable vigilance. But she persisted in this simple act of normalcy, refusing to allow fear or embarrassment to dictate her behavior. The incident had changed her, deepening her understanding of the challenges faced by the communities she served while strengthening her resolve to create positive change within law enforcement. She had experienced firsthand the devastating impact of assumptions and prejudice, and she was determined to ensure that others would not endure the same injustice without consequence. Standing in the checkout line where she had been arrested months earlier, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of quiet reckoning. The pain of that night remained fresh in her memory, as vivid and sharp as broken glass, but it had been transformed through time and determination into something more powerful than victimhood. She had become more than a woman wronged by injustice. She had evolved into an advocate for change, a voice for those who might never be heard above the chorus of assumption and prejudice, and a living reminder that dignity and respect should be extended to every person regardless of their appearance, their circumstances, or the preconceptions that others might harbor about their worth. Her badge had become heavier in the months since her arrest, weighted with new understanding about the responsibility that came with authority and the trust that must exist between law enforcement and the communities they served. As she paid for her groceries and walked toward the exit, Sarah carried with her the knowledge that true justice required more than individual vindication or personal redemption. It demanded systematic change, cultural transformation, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths about bias and prejudice wherever they existed, even within institutions that claimed to uphold fairness and equality. Her badge represented not just authority but sacred responsibility. The responsibility to protect and serve all citizens with equal dedication and respect, regardless of the assumptions that others might make about their guilt or innocence based on the color of their skin. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as they had that first night, their harsh glare no longer intimidating her but serving as a reminder of how much had changed, and how much work remained to be done. She had survived the worst that prejudice could inflict and emerged stronger, wiser, and more committed to her sworn duty than ever before. Every day forward would be an opportunity to build the kind of community and police force that she had always believed possible, one where justice was truly blind, dignity was never conditional, and every person could shop for groceries, walk down the street, or exist in public spaces without fear of being judged, condemned, or arrested based on nothing more than the assumptions of others. The fight for equality was far from over, but Sarah Williams had become living proof that change was possible, one confrontation with injustice at a time.